Gwynny Cór. Fyrkid fáidir ar goléir go dtí áras an Uachtaráin tá súlam go bhfuil sibh buint teanamh as an lá álann se. Agus tá an táilinn faoin aimseir agus Níl Áras tá cuma orí anyway péirbe go bhfuil sibh buint teanamh as an tróna. Áthas ar am héin agus ar ma bhean céile saibhín go raibh sibh go léir in an bhelinn. Dear friends, you're all so welcome here this afternoon to Áras an Uachtaráin, to one of our series of summer garden parties that are held by the President of Ireland, and they've been held since the establishment of the office, really. Dr. Douglas the Hija held the first one in 1939. He actually had two. Now that I think he had 2,000 people at one of them. Now, did they all get a cup of tea? That's a historical question. And then he had a second one and he had 600 children at it. And that was a huge issue in relation to Dr. Douglas the Hood, because he saw that children could be difficult. But it all went well, we're told. Now, I think that this particular garden party, I think in the centenary year of the first great victory, partial victory for women's suffrage on this island, is the theme that we're gathering today, this afternoon. And it's to celebrate the courage of the remarkable women of a century ago who dedicated their efforts to the cause of equality for women. We're in the middle of what has been termed the decade of centenaries, the commemoration of those formative years of the early 20th century, which led ultimately to the establishment of the independent Irish state. Now, that has provided an opportunity to review what do we mean by commemoration, what do we choose to commemorate, and also raises issues of those whom we wish to place a recall from collective memory. And it raises issues too about who is in the collective memory and who has been left out, and what kind of replacement is appropriate to take place. And I have, as President and with others, sought to engage with the challenges as to commemorating in an ethical and inclusive way. The centenary has provided opportunities for inclusion. For far too long, the historical contribution of Irish women to the struggle for emancipation, independence and equality has been overlooked. It has even been eschewed in some respects in our public history. So we need only think of the public spaces of our towns and cities and of our monuments and streets. They have for a very long time been places in which the actions and thoughts of men, usually in a certain pose, usually quite heroic, and on occasion embellished with a sword or a gun and an accommodating horse. And these are what have been valorised, not just in Ireland, but all over Europe. So as President Sabina and I have welcomed the opportunity then to have the opportunity to acknowledge publicly the contribution of that extraordinary revolutionary generation of Irish women of 100 years ago, not only to our long and unremitting struggle for national freedom, but to the other great battles of their time. And that is sometimes forgotten. They were a generation that were aware of the great movements that were taking place in Europe and the world, the state of flux in which Europe was at the present time, and also the ideas that were available that could be of an emancipatory kind. They were impatient for change in an era in which a patriarchal version of society prevailed, one based on exclusions of people on the basis of their gender, race, and perhaps the category which has given the most problem in Irish historiography, class. It has been so hard to get a treatment of class in Irish, not just history, but in political science, sociology, or the social studies. Now, one of the most important changes in recent published work has been the contribution of women to our historiography in all its areas, not solely in women's contribution, but as there had been such a vacuum in effect there, their contribution has been of enormous significance. I sometimes think, as I've been giving these speeches, that it is very important too, in just the same way as the River Nile was there a long time before it was given a name by a British explorer, in the same way women weren't discovered at the end of the 19th century. And I I've been thinking about this, and I think, for example, of women's experience of the famine and the immigration followed, and indeed the impact of seasonal migration on women's lives, which affected every aspect of their life, as I often discussed with my dear friend, the late Tom Murphy. The generation of women we're celebrating today, however, had been endowed with an extraordinary political inheritance in the form of the Ladies' Land League, which took over the leadership and organisation of the land war between 1879 and 82 in its darkest hour. Ginny Wise Power was a member of both the Ladies' Land League and the suffragette movement, and she described the Ladies' Land League as the first national organisation of Irish women, led and organised by women. The Ladies' Land League founded over 500 branches. It addressed mass meetings, it opposed evictions, and very importantly provided shelter for those who were evicted. And all of this was accomplished at considerable risk to themselves, and in the face of the condemnation of polite society and the clergy. They're not exclusive categories. And after all, Archbishop Croke stood alone as the only member of the hierarchy to support them. Led by Anna Parnell, the Ladies' Land League was disbanded through the influence and direction of her brother Charles, not because it had failed, but because on the ground it was too successful. Because it alone was willing to and capable of defying the wishes of the parliamentary voices which were led by Anna's brother, the uncrowned King of Ireland. But when it came to methods of resistance to eviction and response to eviction, their views were not reconcilable. And indeed I have no doubt that it was with suffering for the family members involved that no reconciliation became possible or was achieved within the family. That great tradition then of militant women was drawn on by a generation that stood at the intersection of what Countess Markvik called the three great movements of thought and action which sought to transform Ireland in the early years of the 20th century. The national movement, the women's movement, and the labour movement. And for many who took part, these diverse movements were part of one single struggle for what Constance Markvik called the extension of human liberty. At first, the suffragette movement and branches faced the very same kind of dismissal, and I think it's not unjust to describe so much of it as a sneering disregard that the Ladies' Land League had endured. The attitude of far too many may be summed up in an extract from an edition of the British weekly magazine Vanity Fair from 1896, describing the establishment of a suffrage organisation by Eva and Constance Go Booth in Sligo. Constance was president. Eva, the hard-working one, was secretary. It is reprinted in Dr. Sonia Tiernan's excellent edition of the political writings of Eva Go Booth. And this was how Vanity Fair put it. The new woman is still with us and shows herself where least expected. In the faraway regions of County Sligo, among the wives and daughters of the farmers and fishermen, the three pretty daughters of Sir Henry Go Booth are creating a little excitement, not to say amusement, for the emancipation of their sex. Miss Go Booth and her sister, supported by a few devoted yokels, have been holding a few meetings in connection with the women's suffrage, or shall I say, the revolt of the daughters movement. Their speeches are eloquent, unconventional and non-convincing. They're given to striking out a line for themselves in more senses than one. For Miss Go Booth has already distinguished herself as a lady steeplechaser, and public oratory is their newest toy. The sisters make a pretty picture on the platform, but it is not women of their type who need to assert themselves over man and co. However, it amuses them, and others, and I doubt if the tyrant has much to fear from their little arrows. Now, the author of that piece may have been given, I got that really from Sonia in her wonderful book. The author of that piece may have been given some thoughtful reflection in later years to learn how those little arrows had, with considerable effect, not only lodged but hit their mark, and with what results. The resurgence of women's activism on these islands encompassed then all of the emancipatory movements of that time. I think Eva Go Booth is remarkable in regard to combining all of these projects of equality in her work. She campaigned with Esther Roper on labour rights, gender equality, pacifism, spiritual freedom, as well as with her sister Constance and Irish nationalism. And among all of the issues then that the combined efforts, the resurgence of the women's movement became centred on a most foundational and fundamental aspect of political rights, the right to vote. The suffrage movement on our own island, in its early impulse, owed much to the tireless efforts of Isabella Todd, a Belfast-based Presbyterian, and Anna Haslam, a Quaker and businesswoman from Cork, both of whom never wavered in their support for the union between Britain and Ireland. They began their efforts in the 1870s, and then by 1911, Louis Bennett and Helena Kennedy would found the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation to coordinate what had become by then a constellation of suffrage societies across our island. Indeed, there was an atlas of suffrage societies, and they were joined by organisations of Irish women for whom the campaign for women's suffrage was part of the wider campaign of which Constance Markovic spoke. Inini na HÉireann was founded by Maud Gonne, whose portrait now sits in the Council of State room in Áras and Uachtaráin, previously an all-male room in terms of visual representation, and that's thanks to Sabina, who also has put... Inini na HÉireann was founded as an explicit successor to the Ladies' Land League, campaigning not only for the right to vote but for an independent Irish state. It established the first political journal for women, Ban na HÉireann, edited by Helena Maloney, the Irish Women Workers' Union, organised in 1911 by Delia Larkin and Rosie Hackett, demanded equality not only at the ballot box but in the workplace. Now, 2 weeks ago I had the honour of unveiling a plaque to commemorate Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, the founder, with Margaret Cousins, of the most radical of the suffrage organisations, the Irish Women's Franchise League. It was inspired by the militancy of the Women's Social and Political Union in Britain, those who had become known as suffragettes. The WSPU and the Pankhursts, in particular Christabel, had in their turn looked for their own inspiration to the campaigns for female suffrage and workers' rights carried out in Manchester by Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper, reflecting as it does another error in those cynical prognostications of the journalists of Vanity Fair. I think in Hampstead, what you'll see on the tombstone of Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper is a very important theological statement. Life that is love is God. There it is. The Irish Women's Franchise League began a radical campaign of civil disobedience in 1912 after the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by an anti-suffragist, voted against the Parliamentary Franchise Women Bill, fearful that the British Prime Minister, another anti-suffragist, would derail Home Rule if they did not accede to his wishes. Only days before the vote, a mass meeting of all the suffrage societies in Ireland was held to demand the inclusion of women's suffrage in the Home Rule Bill. And those who spoke from the platform included, and it's a glorious list, Kathleen Lynn, Jenny Wise-Power, Constance Markovic, Delia Larkin. And messages of support were received from feminists such as Helena Maloney, Louis Bennett, James Connolly and George Russell. The vote against the extension of the suffrage was a stunning blow, and despite the many sympathetic Irish Party MPs that for which the MPs selected seemed to presage a home rule, shorn of all its progressive promise, it promised to be a patriarchal home rule Ireland, an Ireland in which women could not vote in parliamentary elections, stand for parliament, or exercise the most basic economic and social rights. Now, all of these campaigns were in the public space, and that meant taking on all the vulnerabilities that included. So we must recall that women were often attacked while campaigning, and that they endured violence and the threat of violence. After 1912, suffrage rallies could often only proceed with security provided by the workers of the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union. 35 suffragettes were convicted of breaking the law in relation to public order between June 1912 and August 1913. 1914. And they were held in Mountjoy and Tullamore jail in sometimes very difficult conditions, where they employed the hunger strike to seek the status of political prisoner. Indeed, reform of prison conditions would turn out to be a theme embraced in later years by many of those incarcerated in this period. Now, as to the vote, it was so largely due to the bravery and the activism of the women's movement in seeking the extension of the franchise to all people, which ensured that the movement that arose from the ashes of 1916 was committed to universal suffrage. It is a testament then to the devotion, courage and energy of the Irish Women's Franchise League, the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation, the Irish Women Workers Union, Inini Nahairn and Cumann that the Irish Free State would in 1923 extend the right of vote, in the words of its constitution, to every person without distinction of sex, everyone over the age of 21. Formal political equality, of course, was not matched by a real or inclusive political equality in the deepest sense, neither was it matched by real economic, social or civic equality. Campaigns for equality were and are necessary rights that have never fallen from the sky. The experience of women in the Sinn Féin movement, for example, in 1918 and 1919, is quite instructive. They had to fight every step of the way to be given a voice, and this was in a political movement that considered itself at the time as the most progressive in the country. And then too, in spite of all the promise of the Easter Proclamation and the democratic programme of the First Dáil Éireann, women had to endure a difficult and long march for equality. Equality in all its forms, economic, social, cultural and civic equality. It has been one that has been marked by many setbacks and defeats, and of course it's not over, but also by many wonderful and hard-won victory. These revolutionary women are testament to the fact that anger over our temporary gestures, which are very necessary at so many times but never sufficient, that politics matters, thus they never gave up. So let us pay tribute this afternoon, 100 years later, to the struggle of those women who 100 years ago sought to shape a truly just, inclusive and sustainable republic of equal citizens. And in our century there are new challenges to be faced and further rights to be won. And if we as citizens of a republic, we wish to be meaningful in the best sense of that term, if we can call up and demonstrate the same indomitable spirit, the same bravery, the same compassion, I am confident that we can continue the work they began so many years ago. Now, Marfocal Square, may I conclude by thanking our MC Katrina Crowe, who herself has played such a pivotal role in our national commemorations. A powerful activist in her own right, of the mind and of the spirit and of the action. For the music we've all enjoyed this afternoon, our thanks to the Dennis Scully duo. They're up at the plough and the stars. You'll notice, in addition to Áras and Uachtaráin this year, there are two things. There's the great acorn, which celebrates the signatories, and there's the birch, the trees that we planted and so on. And then over across from it, our tribute to the lockout of 1913. And both of these are initiatives as well to which my companion in all of this, Sabina, deserves a great deal of credit. I want to thank the Havana Club trio out on the lawn. Muchas gracias a la trio del músico de la America Latina. I have to thank Karen Coleman, the Garda Ladies Choir, and the marvellous Eddie Reader, who has travelled from Scotland to be with us today, with musicians Alan Kelly and Innes White. And because we have a reputation for having superb sound, this is entirely due to Dee Rogers and his team over here. Now, Furin and Áras, you know, they have just been serving everything during the week. Tre Gaeilge, Tris Liam Liv, I congratulate you. It is they who provide it. It is their absolute wonderful warm welcome to you all, as well as all of the things that are made available to you here. That's due to the staff of the Áras, and I thank them. And we've had assistance from our friends in John of God's, the Civil Defence, the Gardaí, and our volunteers in Magashka who act as tour guides, and many, many others who've worked hard to make today an occasion of friendship and joy. Tásúlan gwyna golana si bheith gwain salt agus stanna vás an tróna, agus auch go háire héirí, sé sínta gonrada, gwylyn siansan, honor, agus ahantas cart, a húsas na malá íantacha sin, a cuir tús leis na fiachta séistúile I bhéidir cochra méocht cartana na man. Míle buicas buna ge saltas an ihe gar a míle máge.